Eleanor sat in her worn armchair, the one with the frayed armrests that smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. The living room was a museum of her life photographs in mismatched frames. A chipped teacup from her mother. A quilt she'd stitched during the long winters after her husband passed. At 72, her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were sharp, cutting through the dim light to the open laptop on the coffee table. The screen glowed with an email from her son. Richard. Its words like shards of glass. You're dead weight. Mom. A burden. I can't keep carrying you. The words stung, but Eleanor didn't flinch. She'd raised Richard alone after his father's death, pouring every ounce of her soul into his dreams, his education, his ambitions, his gleaming life in the city. She'd sold her jewelry to pay for his college, worked double shifts at the diner to cover his rent when he started his fancy job. And now, this. Dead weight. A burden. The phrases looped in her mind, but instead of breaking her, they sparked something deeper, quiet, smoldering resolve. She closed the laptop and leaned back, her gaze drifting to the photograph in her hands. It was Richard at 10, grinning gap-toothed at a county fair, his small hand clutching hers. Back then, she was his world, his protector. Now, at 40, he was a stranger who saw her as an inconvenience. Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile, not of defeat, but of clarity. She'd spent decades building his world. If he thought her worthless, she'd let him see what happened when her quiet strength was no longer there to hold it up. The house was silent save for the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. It was a gift from her late husband, George, who'd always said time was the only thing you couldn't borrow. Eleanor had lived by that, savoring every moment with Richard, even when he didn't notice. But now, time felt different, like a tide pulling back before a storm. She stood, her joints protesting, and walked to the kitchen. The linoleum was peeling, the cabinets outdated, but this was her home, her sanctuary. Richard had offered to move her to a facility, some sterile place where she'd be cared for. She'd refused. This house held her memories, her identity. She wouldn't trade it for a cage. That night, she began to plan, not with anger, but with the precision of a woman who'd survived loss and betrayal before. Richard's life was a house of cards, his high-flying career, his polished wife, his perfect children, all built on the foundation of her sacrifices. She'd never asked for gratitude, but she wouldn't accept contempt. She pulled out her old address book, its pages yellowed, and began making calls. Friends, neighbors, old colleagues, people Richard had dismissed as irrelevant. They were her network, her quiet army, and they remembered her kindness when he didn't. The first call was to Margaret, her friend from the diner days. Margaret, now retired, still had connections in the small town where Richard's company had its roots. Eleanor, you don't deserve this, Margaret said, her voice thick with indignation. What do you need? Eleanor's voice was steady. Just a few favors. Maggie. Nothing big. Just reminders. Margaret understood. They all did. The town had watched Eleanor raise Richard, seen her work herself to the bone. They'd seen her pride in him, and now they'd see her pain. Over the next week, Eleanor moved with purpose. She visited the local library, where she'd once read stories to Richard, and spoke to the librarian, Clara, who knew everyone in town. Clara's brother worked at the local paper, and a quiet word from Eleanor planted a seed. She didn't need to say much, just enough to stir curiosity about Richard's company, about the deals he'd made, the corners he'd cut. Eleanor had always known more than she let on. She'd overheard his late-night calls, seen the emails he left open when he visited. She'd never spoken of it, but she remembered. She didn't want revenge. She wanted truth. Richard had built his life on lies to his investors, his wife, even himself. He thought he was untouchable, a titan in a glass tower. But Eleanor knew glass could shatter. She smiled as she mailed a letter to an old friend at the state auditor's office, enclosing a few documents she'd kept from Richard's early days receipts. Contracts. Things he'd dismissed as nothing. They weren't nothing now. By the end of the week, Eleanor felt lighter. Not from joy, but from release. She'd spent years carrying Richard's dreams, his mistakes, his weight. Now, she was letting go. She sat back in her armchair, the photograph of young Richard still in her lap. The clock ticked on, steady and unyielding. She didn't know exactly what would come next, but she knew one thing: Richard's world, so carefully constructed, was about to face a reckoning. And she would watch, not with malice, but with the quiet dignity of a woman who'd given everything and owed nothing. Richard's office in the city was a shrine to his success: sleek glass walls, a mahogany desk, and a view of the skyline that screamed power. At 40, he carried himself like a man who'd conquered the world. His tailored suit, his confident smirk, the way he commanded a room, it all hid the cracks Eleanor had always seen. She'd raised him to be better, but somewhere along the way, he'd chosen ambition over integrity. Now, as he sat in a meeting with his board, his phone buzzed with a message from his assistant, local paper running a story on the company. Something about discrepancies. He dismissed it with a wave. Small-town gossip. Nothing more. His company, a logistics giant, was too big to be rattled by some podunk reporter. But as the day wore on, the messages kept coming. A client canceled a meeting. An investor asked pointed questions about last quarter's numbers. Richard's smirk faltered, but he pushed it aside. He was untouchable. He had to be. Back in her small town, Eleanor was tending her garden, her hands deep in the soil. The roses were her pride, their blooms a testament to patience and care, qualities Richard had forgotten. As she pruned, she thought of the seeds she'd planted over the past week. Not just the calls and letters, but the years of lessons she'd tried to teach him: honesty, humility, respect. He'd ignored them, and now the consequences were blooming. Clara, the librarian, called that afternoon. "It's done, Eleanor. The paper's running the story tomorrow. Just a small piece, but it'll get people talking." Eleanor thanked her, her voice calm but her heart racing. The article wasn't an expose, not yet, just a nudge. A question about a contract Richard's company had won under questionable terms. Eleanor knew the truth would unravel slowly, like a thread pulled from a sweater. She didn't need to destroy him. She only needed to let his own choices do the work. That evening, Richard called. His voice was sharp, accusing. "Mom, what the hell's going on? Some reporters sniffing around. And now my CFO's freaking out. Did you say something to someone?" Eleanor's smile was invisible over the phone, but it was there. "I'm just an old woman. Richard, what could I do?" Her tone was gentle, almost frail, but it carried an edge he didn't catch. He huffed, muttered something about fixing it, and hung up. Eleanor set the phone down and poured herself a cup of tea. The steam curled upward, like a prayer for what was to come. In the days that followed, the cracks in Richard's world widened. The local paper's story caught the eye of a regional outlet, then a state one. Questions about his company's practices, shady deals. Inflated numbers began to circulate. Investors grew nervous, and Richard's polished wife, Vanessa, started asking questions he couldn't answer. She'd always loved the life he provided, the mansion, the vacations. But now, with whispers of scandal, Her adoration wavered. Eleanor knew Vanessa's loyalty was as fragile as Richard's empire. Eleanor didn't revel in this. Her heart ached for the boy she'd raised, the one who'd once promised to buy her a big house when he made it. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who saw her as a liability. She'd given him everything: her savings, her time, her love, and he'd thrown it back in her face. So she kept moving, quietly, methodically. Another call to an old friend, another document sent, another seed planted. She wasn't pulling strings. She was loosening them, letting Richard's own weight drag him down. By the end of the second week, Richard's world was tilting. He spent hours on the phone, shouting at lawyers, placating investors, begging Vanessa to stay calm. He didn't call Eleanor again. She didn't expect him to. Instead, she baked cookies for the church bake sale, her hands steady as she mixed the dough. The townsfolk greeted her warmly, their eyes soft with unspoken understanding. They knew what Richard had done, not because she'd told them, but because small towns talk. And Eleanor's pain was a quiet thunder. As she stood in the church hall, surrounded by laughter and warmth, Eleanor felt a pang of guilt. Was she wrong to let this happen? To let Richard face the consequences of his own making? But then she remembered his words' dead weight. A burden, and the guilt faded. She wasn't destroying him. She was stepping back, letting the truth do its work. She'd carried him long enough. Now, it was his turn to carry himself. The third week brought a storm to Richard's glass tower. The state auditor's office, tipped off by Eleanor's carefully worded letter, launched an informal inquiry into his company's financials. It wasn't a full investigation, not yet, but the mere mention of it sent his stock plummeting. Board members whispered in hushed tones, and Vanessa's questions turned into accusations. "How could you let this happen, Richard?" she snapped, her manicured nails tapping furiously on their marble countertop. He had no answers, only a growing sense of dread. Eleanor, meanwhile, was at the community center, teaching a knitting class to a group of retirees. Her hands moved with the ease of decades, guiding yarn into neat loops. The women around her chatted about their grandchildren, their gardens, their lives. Eleanor listened, her smile soft but distant. She hadn't told them about Richard's email, but they sensed her quiet strength, the way she carried pain without letting it define her. "You're a rock, Eleanor," one woman said, patting her hand. Eleanor only nodded, her thoughts on the storm she'd set in motion. Richard's calls to her grew desperate, though he never apologized. "Mom, you know people in town. Can you talk to them? Get them to back off." His voice was strained, the confidence gone. Eleanor pictured him in his office, tie loosened, hair disheveled. She felt a flicker of pity, but it passed. "I'm just an old woman, Richard," she repeated, her voice steady. "I don't know anything about your business." It was a lie, but one he'd earned. He'd underestimated her, forgotten the woman who'd balanced budgets on a waitress's salary, who'd taught him to read, to dream, to fight. Now, she was teaching him something else: accountability. The media frenzy grew. A national outlet picked up the story, framing Richard as a symbol of corporate greed. His face was plastered on websites, his name dragged through headlines. Eleanor didn't read them. She didn't need to. She saw the effects in the way Richard's voice shook, in the way Vanessa stopped answering his calls. Their perfect life, the one Eleanor had helped build, was unraveling, and she hadn't lifted a finger to stop it. She'd only given the truth a nudge. At home, Eleanor sorted through old letters, keepsakes from a life well lived. She found a card Richard had made at 12, scrawled with "I love you, Mom," in crayon. Her chest tightened, but she didn't cry. She'd cried enough when he left for the city, when he stopped visiting, when he sent that email. Now, she was done mourning the son who'd turned his back on her. She placed the card back in its box and closed the lid. A small act of closure. The town rallied around her, not out of pity but respect. They brought her casseroles, invited her to card games, shared stories of their own children's betrayals. Eleanor listened, her heart heavy but unbroken. She wasn't alone, even if Richard thought she was. Her life, though modest, was rich with connection, with meaning. His, built on ambition and deceit, was crumbling under its own weight. By the end of the week, Richard's company was in chaos. The board demanded his resignation, and Vanessa packed a suitcase, taking their children to her mother's. Richard called Eleanor one last time, his voice raw. "Mom, I'm losing everything. Please, help me." For a moment, she wavered. He was her son, her only child. But then she remembered the photograph, the boy who'd loved her, and the man who'd called her a burden. "You made your choices, Richard," she said softly. "Now you live with them." She hung up, her hands trembling but her resolve firm. That night, Eleanor sat in her garden, the roses glowing under the moonlight. She thought of George, of the life they'd built together, of the son they'd raised with love. She'd done her part. Now, she would let the world do its. The clock in the house ticked on, steady as ever, and Eleanor smiled a real smile, not of triumph but of peace. She was no one's burden. She was Eleanor, and she was enough. Richard's world didn't just collapse, it imploded. The auditor's inquiry turned formal, and the evidence Eleanor had quietly shared, those old receipts, contracts, and emails, became a noose. His company's stock tanked. Investors fled, and the board forced him out. The headlines were merciless, painting him as a fraud who'd built an empire on lies. Vanessa filed for divorce, her lawyers citing irreconcilable differences fueled by the public humiliation. Richard's mansion, once a symbol of his triumph, was put up for sale to cover legal fees. Eleanor heard the news through Margaret, who called with a mix of sympathy and indignation. "He's getting what he deserves, Eleanor, but I'm sorry it's come to this." Eleanor nodded, though Margaret couldn't see. "It's not about deserving," she said. "It's about truth." She hung up and walked to her porch, where the morning sun warmed her face. The town was buzzing with the scandal, but Eleanor stayed quiet, letting the world turn without her commentary. She'd done enough. She spent her days tending to her roses, visiting the library, and helping at the community center. Her life was small, but it was hers, filled with people who valued her. The townsfolk didn't gloat over Richard's fall. They simply closed ranks around Eleanor, their loyalty a silent rebuke to his betrayal. She felt their love in every shared meal, every kind word, every knowing glance. She wasn't alone, and she never had been. Richard, meanwhile, was a ghost in his own life. He rented a cramped apartment in the city, far from the mansion's grandeur. His phone, once buzzing with calls from power brokers, was silent. He tried to rebuild, sending out resumes, pitching new ventures, but his name was poisoned now. The man who'd called his mother a burden was learning what it meant to carry real weight: shame, failure, isolation. One evening, Eleanor received a letter. Not an email this time. Richard's handwriting was shaky, the paper plain. "Mom, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I don't know how to fix this." The words were raw, unguarded, the first honest thing he'd said in years. Eleanor read it twice, her heart caught between love and resolve. She didn't write back. Not yet. She needed time. not to punish him, but to protect herself. She'd given him her life once. She wouldn't do it again without proof he'd changed. The town began to heal. And so did Eleanor. She started a book club at the library, sharing stories of resilience and redemption with her neighbors. She laughed more, her smile no longer tinged with sorrow. The photograph of young Richard stayed in its box, but she didn't throw it away. It was a reminder of what was, not what could be. She was building a new chapter, one where she wasn't defined by his choices. Richard's fall was a lesson, not just for him, but for the town. People talked about integrity, about family, about the cost of ambition. Eleanor didn't preach. She didn't need to. Her life, her quiet strength, her unwavering dignity spoke louder than words. She was no one's burden, and the world was starting to see it. As winter approached, Eleanor prepared her garden for the cold, wrapping her roses in burlap. She thought of Richard, alone in his apartment, facing a winter of his own. She hoped he'd find his way, not for her sake, but for his. She'd given him the tools once love, courage, honesty. Whether he used them now was up to him. Spring came, and with it, a shift. Eleanor's garden bloomed brighter than ever, the roses a riot of color against the modest house. The town had moved on from Richard's scandal, though it lingered in quiet conversations. Eleanor, too, had moved forward, her days filled with purpose. She volunteered more, taught more classes, even started painting again, her brushstrokes capturing the beauty of her small world. She was no longer just Richard's mother. She was Eleanor, whole and unbroken. Richard, meanwhile, was rebuilding, but it was slow. He'd taken a job at a small logistics firm, far from the corner office he'd once had. The work was humbling long hours, low pay, but it was honest. He wrote to Eleanor again, longer this time, detailing his mistakes, his regrets, his tentative steps toward change. I see now what I did to you, to us. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to try. Eleanor read the letter by her kitchen window, the morning light soft on her face. She felt a flicker of hope, but she wasn't ready to open that door. Not yet. The community center became her haven, a place where her wisdom was sought, her presence cherished. She organized a fundraiser for the library, rallying the town with her quiet charisma. People marveled at her strength, at how she'd faced betrayal and emerged not bitter but radiant. You're an inspiration, Eleanor, Clara said, her eyes bright with admiration. Eleanor only smiled. I'm just living, she said, and meant it. Richard visited the town one weekend, unannounced. He stood outside her house, hesitant, his once confident stride gone. Eleanor saw him from the porch, her heart catching. He looked older, thinner, his eyes shadowed with something like remorse. She didn't invite him in, but she didn't turn him away. Why are you here, Richard? She asked, her voice steady but kind. He shifted, nervous. I wanted to see you, to say I'm sorry. In person. She nodded, letting the silence stretch. Words are easy, she said finally. Show me. He stayed in town for a week, renting a room at the inn. He didn't push, didn't demand. He helped at the community center, carried boxes for the fundraiser, listened to the townsfolk who eyed him warily. Eleanor watched, not with judgment, but with caution. She saw glimpses of the boy she'd raised, the one who'd helped her plant roses, who'd laughed at her stories. But she also saw the man who'd hurt her, and she wouldn't forget. By the end of the week, Richard left, promising to return. Eleanor didn't promise anything in return. She was learning to protect her heart, to value herself as much as she'd valued him. She sat in her armchair that night, the photograph in her hands again. This time, she didn't feel pain, only a quiet acceptance. She'd given Richard everything once. Now, she was giving herself the same. The town noticed the change in her, the way she carried herself with a new lightness. They didn't ask about Richard, and she didn't tell. Her life was hers now, not defined by his rise or fall. She was Eleanor, and that was enough. A year passed, and Eleanor's life was a tapestry of small joys. Her garden thrived. Her paintings hung in the community center, and her book club grew, drawing people from neighboring towns. She was a pillar, not because she sought it, but because her resilience inspired it. The pain of Richard's words had faded, replaced by a quiet pride in who she'd become. She wasn't just surviving. She was living, fully and fiercely. Richard visited more often, each trip a step toward redemption. He worked at the small firm, kept his head down, and slowly earned back trust not just from the town, but from himself. He helped Eleanor with her garden, their hands in the soil together, like when he was a boy. They didn't talk about the past, not directly, but every shared moment was a bridge, fragile but growing stronger. Eleanor saw the change in him, the humility, the effort. She didn't forgive easily, but she began to believe he was trying. One evening, as they sat on her porch, Richard spoke. "I was wrong, Mom. About everything. You weren't a burden, you were my foundation. I'm sorry it took losing everything to see that." His voice broke, and for the first time, Eleanor saw tears in his eyes. She reached for his hand, her own steady. "I never stopped loving you," she said, "but I had to love myself too." He nodded, understanding, and they sat in silence, the weight of years lifting just a little. Eleanor's life didn't revolve around Richard's redemption, though. She had her own story, now her roses, her paintings, her community. She'd let his world collapse, not out of cruelty, but to show him what she'd always known, that truth matters. That love is earned. That strength isn't loud but quiet, steady, enduring. She'd been called a burden, but she'd proven she was anything but. The clock on the mantel ticked on, its rhythm a reminder of time's unyielding march. Eleanor didn't need to carry Richard anymore, but she chose to walk beside him, as long as he kept trying. Her smile, once tinged with sorrow, was now one of peace, of pride, of a woman who'd faced betrayal and emerged whole. She was Eleanor, and her world built on love, truth, and resilience was unshakable.